if you are a civilian that's standing there in the middle of Rafah, you have been told by aid workers and NGOs that this is the safe place to be throughout the duration of this conflict. And now you're told to leave. Well, everywhere, every option you have is, I would imagine, one that brings fear, because that's where the last airstrikes were. Overnight, we saw airstrikes in Rafah as well. And the Palestinian media is reporting civilian deaths in some of these strikes.
Israel has suggested it's ready to begin its attack on Rafah immediately as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the country to remind Benjamin Netanyahu of his opposition to such a campaign. He's also been putting pressure on Hamas to accept the latest ceasefire deal. We're joined, as we often are, by Zach Anders, video journalist in Israel. Good morning, Zach.
Good morning.
The Rafah incursion has been much debated day after day, week after week. Do you feel that we're close to it actually happening?
Well, militarily, the amount of equipment that's staged and the movement of the divisions, the battalions, how they've been allocated leave over the past several weeks and kind of prepared for military action in Rafah, it's certainly very close. Some of the conversations I've had has led me to believe that we could see a window as soon as next week, or this week, even later this week, where we'd start to see civilians told to move out of the area. Then the question would be, how long is there going to be a period of civilian evacuation? We know that they've built some camps in Khan Yunis. It doesn't look like, through the satellite images, that they're large enough to support the million plus that are in Rafah. In the past, when they've told people to evacuate, they've dropped pamphlets, sent text messages, and called people in the area, and that hasn't happened yet. But I think some of the statements from Netanyahu and his government have been somewhat cryptic about whether or not they're going to be providing a long period of civilian evacuation. And with the amount of military equipment, think tanks and large personnel carriers that are literally within eyesight of the edge of Rafah because of how close the border fence is. I mean, this could be very close, and it could come really with very little warning.
But where do all these people go then? If you, as you say, there's Khan Yunis where they're building some camps, but this is 1 million people. Presumably there's a security issue of 1 million people moving, some of whom may well have connections to Hamas, and the Israelis won't want them to move out of the area or be allowed to move freely. It strikes me as a very important moment, because if the US is saying don't do it and there's humanitarian concerns, if Israel do it and there is humanitarian damage, innocent people are killed, which you've got to imagine will happen, does that become a very significant point in terms of support for Israel around the world, particularly the US?
You would think so. The last thing that Blinken said, and he's here on his 7th trip to Israel, the last thing he said was that the red line is a Rafah operation with no credible plan to evacuate civilians. Well, if you're a civilian in Rafah right now, there's been airstrikes in the eastern half of the city, and there's been airstrikes in the humanitarian zone to the west of the city. And of course, Khan Yunis has been absolutely devastated to their north. You can't go south. That's Egypt. So where exactly, if you are a civilian that's standing there in the middle of Rafah, you have been told by aid workers and NGOs that this is the safe place to be throughout the duration of this conflict, and now you're told to leave. Well, everywhere, every option you have is, I would imagine, one that brings fear, because that's where the last airstrikes were. Overnight, we saw airstrikes in Rafah as well, and the Palestinian media is reporting civilian deaths in some of these strikes. I think what might be lost in the last week and a half, as we've been so hyper-focused on what is happening with the hostage deal, is the fact that the IDF has been doing this campaign of softening targets where they're striking by air the buildings and places where they know they're going to be moving through, and trying to widen these corridors where they're going to conduct this military campaign. So how do you move 1 million people? It's a great question from, a standpoint of 2 to 3 days. Is that possible? I mean, that doesn't seem likely. And
then the word credible becomes the key one, doesn't it? Because the Israelis will always say, oh, we've got a plan. We've got a humanitarian plan. They've always said throughout this conflict, we do our best. We do whatever we can to limit damage, but damage happens nonetheless. the pressure's on Netanyahu. I mean, Trump was talking this week where he said he has no time for Netanyahu. There's clearly an awful lot of political pressure on Biden in regard to his relationship with Israel. How much pressure is Netanyahu on? Where do you judge his own political future, political health at the moment?
Well, the coalitions that brought him to power last year, because that election, remember that Netanyahu was reelected under indictment. There was investigations into corruption. There's a corruption case that was ongoing in the middle of his election last year. He comes to power under a coalition of far-right Zionist political leaders who gave him the ability to be prime minister again. One of those ministers, the settlement minister, her name is Orit Saruk, said she's a member of the far-right religious Zionism party. She said yesterday on Army radio, quote, "The deal is horrible and terrible. A government that throws everything in the trash in order to return 22 or 23 people has no right to resist." That got a lot of backlash. She's since walked back some of those comments and made it about how she thinks the deal in general does not support Israel's war aims. But you have to remember these scenes that are taking place in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv every single night. There are thousands of people who are demanding that the hostage deal is done under any terms, any circumstance. For Netanyahu, this is him. I mean, he's verbally walked himself into a corner. He said just about every day over the past week that last half of the week, last 3 or 4 days, I would say, he said that a hostage deal is going to be the main aim, but a Rafah operation will happen no matter what. And he reiterates that again when he's meeting with Blinken.
I,
So
I just wonder, Zach, whether the more we talk about this, if the Israelis knew where these hostages were, there'd be more attempts to get them out. Is there not a big fear that this conversation, this demand for return of hostages, Hamas might not even have them anymore? Many of them may be dead. And therefore, the demands of the public, correctly, of Netanyahu's demands of the situation, might all be based on something that actually can't happen. You can't return hostages because they're not there anymore.
I think there's certainly some. There has to be. It's believed that at least 129 are still held by Hamas, and that the IDF said through their intelligence with soldiers that were on the ground and what they were able to gather, they think roughly 30 of those have been killed. This deal that's on the table, and it is, the framework of the deal that's being reported is coming through a single source in Lebanon, a single paper in Lebanon. So I'm happy to be corrected. But over the last 24 hours, every media channel in Israel has attributed and quoted this one source. So I'm hesitant to say this is the actual framework of the deal. But Israeli media has jumped on the fact that the deal as it stands is 3 phases. And in the first 40 days, at least 33 hostages are going to be released, 3 on the first day, and then 3 every single day. And that the negotiations are arguing about specific streets that the IDF will withdraw from, how many fuel trucks per day they're going to let in for which plant that's going to supply power to which areas. So they're getting so much more specific than what we saw in November over the last hostage deal. But you're right. How many of those hostages are alive? I think in the last week, Hamas has tried to push this along by releasing 2 new videos of detainees, of hostages, trying to show proof of life. But again, are those videos that were filmed weeks ago? Are they still alive? But I think the main thing here is that the initial deal is getting the remaining women and children, the under 19s and the elderly. That's the first 33 that's being negotiated over. If Netanyahu can get those out, then what remains are the male soldiers and the female soldiers that have been detained. I can imagine that the 33 hostages that they're negotiating over, that they've gotten this far to at this stage of the negotiations, that they believe there's credible evidence that at least those 33 are alive.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. And let's hope this moves on to a point where they start to come home. Zach, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.